Imagine a superpower that has run out of ammunition before the war even begins. This is not a scene from a dystopian novel. It is the cold mathematical reality of the United States in 2025. For the first time in history, the chaotic noise of Washington's printing presses has drowned out the sound of its own artillery. We are told that debt is just a number, but when that number hits $37 trillion, it ceases to be economics and becomes a national security threat. While you are distracted by the stock market, the Pentagon is quietly realizing they can no longer afford the shield that protects it. The enemy is not at the gates. The enemy is on the balance sheet. And the world's predators, China and Russia, are watching the American check bounce. Is the next world war inevitable simply because America can no longer afford the price of peace? Before we go further, we need to strip away the political theater and understand one cold fact. The United States national debt is not just a number on a clock. It is a measure of national vulnerability. It operates on three fatal mechanisms that the mainstream media conveniently ignores. First, we face the interest eclipse. This is the mathematical certainty that the cost of past mistakes is now destroying the budget for future survival. The exorbitant privilege that allowed America to print its way to power is mutating into an exorbitant weakness. The financial system is no longer engineered to protect your prosperity. It is engineered to ensure bondholders get paid before soldiers get equipped. Second is deterrence erosion. In modern warfare, enemies do not just count your missiles. They audit your balance sheet. When adversaries like China calculate that Washington is too broke to fight back, your military might becomes irrelevant. Finally, we have the alliance fracture. The entire Western order relies on the belief that America can afford to save its friends. But when those friends realize the lifeguard is drowning in red ink, they stop calling for help and start looking for new partners. The foundation of American dominance was never just about having the most aircraft carriers. It was about the undeniable ability to pay for them. That foundation is cracked. But to understand how this strategic insolvency became inevitable, we must look at the timeline. But when exactly did the shield break? This collapse did not begin with the breadlines of 1929. It effectively became irreversible in fiscal year 2024, when a specific terrifying threshold was crossed. For decades, the solution chosen by Washington was simple: ignore and inflate. This strategy worked as long as the world had no other choice but the dollar. But in 2024, a silent alarm rang inside the Pentagon. For the first time in history, the United States government spent more on interest payments, a staggering $882 billion, than it did on its entire national defense, which stood at $874 billion. Let that sink in. We are now paying more to satisfy bankers and foreign bondholders than we are to equip the soldiers, sailors, and pilots who defend our borders. This was the precise moment the empire of debt officially cannibalized the empire of liberty. This path was not chosen through a grand strategic vision. It was paved by sheer institutional negligence. By 2025, the interest on this debt is projected to hit $1 trillion, eclipsing the budgets of the Department of Defense and Medicare combined. The shield has not just been weakened, it is being sold for scrap to pay the interest on the loan. How does this math actually trigger a war? The machinery of modern war is powered not by gunpowder, but by a functional balance sheet. When that balance sheet breaks, the gears of the military machine begin to grind to a halt. This is the doom loop, a three-stage mechanical failure of national power that invites aggression by the very fact of its existence. The first stage is the budgetary heart attack. As billionaire investor Ray Dalio warned, we are facing a debt heart attack in the immediate future. This mechanism works through the compounding of mandatory spending, which effectively erases the government's discretionary power. By the end of 2025, interest costs alone are projected to hit $1 trillion. This is not capital being invested in roads, schools, or tanks. It is money thrown into a furnace simply to keep the lights on. The system has reached a terminal stage where it must borrow new money just to pay the interest on the money it already spent. This interest-rife environment is an invisible tax on every strategic decision Washington attempts to make. This leads directly into the second stage, technological atrophy. You cannot fight a 21st century war with 20th century tools, yet the debt is forcing a freeze on the future. When interest payments crowd out the budget, the military is forced to cancel the very projects meant to ensure its survival. We are no longer cutting fat, we are cutting into the bone. Crucial modernization efforts for the Navy and Army are being delayed or gutted. The advanced ballistic missile submarines required to deter a conflict over Taiwan cost approximately $132 billion, a price tag that is becoming an impossible burden. While our technology races toward obsolescence, our debt races toward the ceiling. The system is freezing in place, paralyzed by its own weight. This internal decay creates the third stage, the predator's calculation. Adversaries like China and Russia do not need to defeat the United States military in a head-to-head battle if they can simply wait for the US Treasury to collapse under its own gravity. They are exploiting this window of fiscal weakness without firing a single shot. By accelerating de-dollarization and expanding the BRICS Plus bloc, which already controls 41% of the global economy, they are building a new financial basement to insulate themselves when the American house of cards inevitably falls. They see the declining investment in American power and the rising cost of American debt. They smell blood in the water. They know that a superpower that cannot afford its own defense is a superpower that can be challenged with impunity. The math is clear. and the predators have done the audit. But has this ever happened before? History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes with a haunting precision. A classic example is the Great Depression's impact on World War II readiness. When the economy collapsed in the 1930s, the United States gutted its military size and equipment to save pennies while the world began to burn. The result was a near-fatal lack of preparedness when war actually arrived, leaving American forces scrambled and under-equipped against modernized adversaries. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio explicitly compares our current moment to that era, a toxic cocktail of high debt, extreme political polarization, and the rise of authoritarian powers. But there is a terrifying difference this time. Back then, the United States had years to rebuild because two vast oceans provided a physical shield. Today, in an era of hypersonic missiles, instant cyber warfare, and orbital strikes, the luxury of a ramp-up period has evaporated. We have already seen the modern prologue to this disaster. The 2013 budget sequestration slashed military readiness and left deep scars that the armed forces still bear today. When money dries up, training stops, maintenance is deferred, and the edge of superiority dulls, history is screaming a cold truth that Washington refuses to hear. A broke nation is a vulnerable nation, and a vulnerable nation is an invitation to catastrophe. We are entering a window where our enemies know we cannot afford a mistake, let alone a war. But the infection is spreading far beyond the military budget. Over time, the debt crisis does not stop at the gates of the Pentagon. It spreads like a contagion to NATO, the Pacific allies, and the entire framework of global diplomacy. The logic is cold and consistent, but the variation is geopolitically catastrophic. We have long operated under the assumption that if the United States sneezes, NATO catches a cold. But if the United States suffers a debt heart attack, NATO dies. This unsustainable debt level directly threatens America's ability to fund its overseas commitments, creating a vacuum that our allies are already beginning to notice. The strategic safety guarantee that has underpinned world peace since 1945 is only as valuable as the bank account backing it. If Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan perceive that Washington can no longer afford to deploy and sustain its fleet in the Pacific due to a domestic budget crisis, they will not wait for a formal apology. They will seek new arrangements to ensure their own survival, arrangements that may lead them straight into the orbit of Beijing. A debt-ridden America is an America that cannot honor its word. When the check for collective security starts bouncing, the alliances built on decades of trust will fracture into 1,000 pieces. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar once bought us loyalty. Now our insolvency is buying us isolation. We are witnessing the slow-motion collapse of a diplomatic order that we simply forgot to pay for. But this is not just a high-level game played by diplomats in suits. What does this mean for your bank account? Today you do not need to be drafted into a trench to become a casualty of this war. Just by holding US dollars, you are already paying for the fiscal mistakes of the past via a brutal combination of inflation and financial repression. The government has arrived at a mathematical dead end with only two exits: an explicit default, which would shatter the global economy, or a strategic inflation of the currency, which systematically destroys your savings. History shows they will always choose the latter. This is what economists call the silent tax. The Congressional Budget Office projects that real GDP growth will slow to an average of just 1.6% over the next 30 years, a significant decline from the 2.5% average we enjoyed in the past. This slowdown is the direct result of crowding out, where the government's desperate need to borrow sucks the oxygen out of the room for private investment. Your purchasing power is being liquidated in real time to service the interest on a $37 trillion debt. You are not just a spectator in this crisis. You are the collateral damage in a war of attrition that has not even been officially declared. Every time the Federal Reserve prints to cover a deficit, the value of the labor you have already performed is diluted. You are running faster just to stay in the same place while the system uses your life savings as fuel to keep its own engine from seizing up. The American dream is being refinanced to pay for an American nightmare of interest payments. So is it over? And here is the most critical point. The debt crisis exists not because of some secret cabal, but because the political cost of fixing it is higher than the political cost of ignoring it. This is a tragedy of incentives. The question is no longer if the crisis will hit, but when the global creditors decide to pull the plug on the American experiment of infinite borrowing. We were warned. As far back as 2010, Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated clearly that the national debt is the single biggest threat to our national security. He understood that as the debt rises, we become increasingly dependent on foreign lenders and have fewer resources to invest in our own strength. We ignored him. Today the silence is even more deafening. As Ray Dalio observes, business leaders and investors are staying silent, paralyzed by the fear of political retaliation if they speak the truth about these systemic risks. This fear is preventing the open discussions necessary to avoid a total collapse. We are sleepwalking into a trap of our own design, fueled by an addiction to cheap credit and a refusal to acknowledge that the checkbook is empty. The machinery of war requires a massive, sustained flow of capital, but the trap is already sprung. We are no longer the masters of our financial destiny. We are the subjects of our own interest payments. The ledger is closing, and the debt heart attack is nearing. There is no happy ending to this story. There is only math. Throughout history, from Rome to Britain, Every empire that lost control of its ledger eventually lost control of its borders. The United States is currently spending its way into a position of weakness that makes conflict not just possible, but probable. By the end of 2025, the national debt is projected to hit $37 trillion, a figure that represents the highest ratio to the economy since World War II. When a superpower can no longer afford to deter its enemies, the enemies stop being deterred. The interest on this debt is already cannibalizing the very military meant to protect the world order. This fiscal wall is not just a burden for the next generation, it is a green light for every dictator and rival power watching from the shadows. As predicted by the world's most successful investors, the debt heart attack is coming, and the hospital is closed. You now have the information that Wall Street whispers, but Washington ignores. The system is fragile, the cycle is turning, and the only thing you can control is your own preparation. If you understand the gravity of this historical moment, type 1 in the comments. Subscribe to Financial Money History to decode the signals before the noise becomes deafening.